A few episodes previously, I promised we would come back to the British naturalist who co-discovered the principle of evolution through natural selection. This was Darwin's contemporary, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was the co-discoverer with Darwin of the principle of evolution by natural selection. Yet, in many ways, Wallace is an asterisk to Darwin. We often speak of Darwinism. You almost never hear about Wallaceism. Why is that? In this episode and the next, we're going to explore that question. In 1857, Wallace was working in the Malay archipelago, collecting natural history specimens. During his 8-year sojourn there, Wallace had been thinking about the many varieties of animals and plants he had observed. Eventually, all the pieces fell into place for Wallace to make sense of it all. So, Wallace sent off a letter to the naturalist he admired most in the world, Charles Darwin, to get his opinion. To Darwin's shock, Wallace had solved the problem of the origin of species. Wallace's idea was essentially Darwin's own, which he had been working on for nearly 20 years. Now, quick, when I say evolution by natural selection, whose name is the first that pops into your head? It almost certainly will be Charles Darwin's. And if you do a survey, very few will mention the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Yet both Darwin and Wallace had come to the same idea independently. By all rights, Wallace's name should be right up there with Darwin's, but it's not. You can prove this to yourself by searching for lists of the greatest scientists of all time. The lists differ from one another in details, obviously, but Darwin's name is always up there in the top 5. Wallace's name is never there. Here's an example from Discover magazine, which unironically headlines Darwin's entry as the bringer of the gospel of evolution. Show this to the next creationist you encounter. It's not really a gospel, of course, but it is what has become a Darwinian orthodoxy. As I've said elsewhere in this series, orthodoxy should be an utterly alien concept in science. Yet we see the footprints of a Darwinian orthodoxy all over the history of evolutionary thought. All history must be shaped as approaches to the correct doctrine, the orthodox doctrine, the Darwinian good news. So Lamarck and Cuvier must be portrayed as wrong-headed precursors to the correct Darwinian theory, sort of like John the Baptist to Jesus. Never mind that Darwin's own theory of heredity was thoroughly Lamarckian, or that Cuvier must be portrayed as some kind of creationist, even though he was clearly an evolutionist. Something similar has happened to Alfred Russel Wallace. He departed from the orthodoxy. Even though he has as strong a claim as Darwin to the idea of evolution by natural selection, Wallace has been reduced to Darwin's moon. Impossible to ignore, still in the Darwinian orbit, but ultimately eclipsed by the great sun of Darwin. Demoted, like Pluto. Wallace has always been a problematic figure for both supporters and critics of the Darwinian idea. For example, a long-standing trope among Marxist historians of science is that Darwin's theory of natural selection was simply a reflection of Darwin's own bourgeois, capitalist, landowning class, and therefore bad, even though Marx himself was an ardent admirer of Darwin's ideas. Wallace puts that assertion to a critical test. Wallace came from an entirely different social class from Darwin's. He was solidly working class and socialist in his political outlook. Yet, he independently arrived at the same idea that Darwin did, of evolution through natural selection. So much for that. Wallace was born in Usk in South Wales into a struggling family, not well endowed, and he had to scramble his way to a living in any way he could. For a time, he was a carpenter's apprentice. After that, he worked for his brother as a land surveyor. All along, though, he had a fascination with natural history, and he developed his interest through a local mechanics institute, a kind of technical college/social club for members of his class. For a short time, he taught surveying and construction at the Leicester Collegiate School. And at one point, he decided to have a go at making a living as a collector of natural history specimens from universities, museums, and gentlemen fanciers of England. So in 1848, along with a partner, Alan Bates, Wallace traveled to Brazil. Wallace and Bates spent 4 years there, collecting an enormous trove of birds, mammals, insects, and plants. They split up their explorations to maximize their yields. Bates collected mainly along the Amazon, while Wallace went up the Rio Negro into present-day Venezuela. Wallace's Brazil expedition ended in disaster when the ship carrying him and his precious specimens and notebooks back to England caught fire and sunk in the Atlantic. Fortunately, his cargo was insured, and this allowed him to regroup, writing up what he could from his Amazon expedition, and to finance another collecting expedition, this time to the Malay Archipelago. Wallace was to spend 8 years there. Compared to his Brazil expedition, Wallace's expedition to the Malay Archipelago was a tremendous success. He was able to collect and send back to England an enormous trove of specimens from an unknown and very interesting part of the world. He not only was able to make his living, he built his reputation as a top-ranking naturalist. This was because Wallace was no mere collector. He made extensive field notes and built up an enormous body of evidence about local varieties and species of animals and plants. Like Darwin, he was interested in explaining where these varieties came from, and, by implication, where species came from. Because he spent a much longer time on the ground than Darwin did, Wallace was also able to take a more scientific approach to natural history. If Wallace had an idea about how the biota of the Malay Archipelago was formed, he could revisit his collecting sites to test his idea. Darwin's collecting, in contrast, was constrained by the demands of the Beagle's voyage. Darwin spent only 5 weeks in the Galapagos, for example. Not quite a grab and go, but not 8 years. And Darwin was never able to return to test his ideas, like Wallace could. The most famous example of Wallace's scientific approach to natural history is Wallace's Line, which meanders through the middle of the archipelago. To the south and east of Wallace's Line, the plants and animals were similar to the biota of Australia. To the north and west, the flora and fauna were very similar to the biota of Asia. This observation was only possible because Wallace could revisit sites throughout the archipelago. In mapping out this geographic pattern, Wallace established an entirely new discipline known as biogeography. As an aside, Wallace's Line also provided unexpected support for another radical theory, continental drift or plate tectonics, that came bubbling up in the early 20th century. This was the notion that continents floated around on movable continental plates, floating on a fluid magma. Wallace's Line exists because the Malay Archipelago sits astride the so-called Pacific Ring of Fire, volcanoes that are arrayed along the rim of the Pacific Basin. These volcanoes are there because upwelling magma is pushing 2 continental plates apart from one another. Thus, the continental plate that carries Australia and New Zealand is being gradually pushed away to the south and east from the continental plate of the Asian mainland. And over time, the Australian biota will become increasingly isolated from the Asian biota. Wallace's Line demarcates this zone of increasing isolation. Wallace was able to observe more fine-scale variation, however, which led him to basic questions about the origin of species. For example, here are 4 specimens from Wallace's collection of a bird known as the friar bird, and here's what the friar bird looks like in life. Friar birds are from the Australian side of Wallace's Line. These specimens are all from Flores Island and the Lesser Sunda Islands of Indonesia. Even though they are all from the same small island, you can see very clearly the variation in the size of the protuberance on the upper beak. What's the meaning of this variation? Were these different varieties of the same species, or were they distinct species? This was the type of question that kept popping up in Wallace's mind and that he wanted to answer. The answer he came up with is encapsulated in the title of his 1855 paper on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. This paper was Darwin's introduction to Wallace. One of the most remarkable stories in the history of science is the convergence of both Wallace and Darwin onto the same basic idea of evolution by natural selection. Wallace's edging up to the solution came with an idea to explain the patterns of varieties he was observing, like those varieties of friar birds. Wallace thought that these varieties could have resulted from a continuous divergence of form from some common ancestor. He had seen this pattern often enough to think it might represent a general pattern. And this was the origin of Wallace's 1855 paper, known now as the Sarawak paper. Sarawak was a province of Borneo. In his Sarawak paper, Wallace made several points about the geographic distribution of variation of form, like those protuberances on the beaks of friar birds. One of the patterns he saw was that varieties found in close geographic proximity to one another tend to be more similar than varieties that are located far from one another. And from there, it was a short leap to a theory for the origin of species. If geographic proximity was important, Wallace thought, why not proximity in time? If varieties departed continuously from some original type, over longer and longer periods of time, new species could arise from the ongoing departure of varieties from their original type. And what were species, Wallace reasoned, but magnified varieties? What Wallace was lacking, however, was some explanation for why varieties departed continuously from one another. And what followed was the convergence of Wallace's and Darwin's thinking that historians still dispute. Here's a rough timeline of how events unfolded. By the 1830s, Darwin had hit upon his idea of natural selection, prompted by his reading of Thomas Malthus. That left Darwin with a quandary. He had a putative mechanism for the origin of species, namely natural selection, but he had no real evidence for it. From the time he read Malthus and had hit upon the idea of natural selection, Darwin would spend the next 20 years trying to find that evidence. In the meantime, he spent 8 years working on diversity of barnacles. He spent several years in futile experiments floating seeds in seawater to see if they could survive long times drifting from place to place across oceans. He spent a lot of time hanging around with pigeon fanciers and bred pigeons himself to get a handle on artificial selection. By the mid-1850s, when Wallace began to come onto the scene, Darwin still lacked a convincing case that natural selection operated in nature. He had his mechanism, but no convincing evidence from nature that it worked. By 1855, Wallace found himself with the opposite problem to Darwin. He had observed patterns of divergence in nature, that was the evidence Darwin lacked, but he had as yet no mechanism to explain it. And this is when Wallace opened up his correspondence with Darwin by sending him a copy of his Sarawak paper. Over several exchanges of letters, Darwin began to see that Wallace's idea provided the evidence from nature that he was so far lacking. At this point, Darwin now had both a theory of natural selection and evidence from nature that he needed to make his case, and Darwin's path to publishing his magnum opus was now open. The problem was that the evidence was Wallace's, not Darwin's. Then, in 1858, the wheels came off. By then, Wallace had also read Malthus, and in one of those inspirational moments, Wallace conceived of the mechanism he needed to explain the patterns of variation he was seeing. And this was Wallace's independent conception of the principle of natural selection. Wallace himself said it came to him during a bout of malarial fever. Wallace then wrote up his thoughts and sent a manuscript off to Darwin to see what he thought of Wallace's idea. This set off a frenzied panic among Darwin and his colleagues. Darwin had spent 20 years working on building a case for the principle of natural selection that he had conceived in the 1830s, and now Wallace would be able to snatch away priority for Darwin's idea. In the end, Darwin's colleagues worked out a compromise whereby both Wallace and Darwin would present simultaneous papers to a special meeting of the Linnaean Society. And in this way, both Wallace and Darwin would be able to claim credit for arriving simultaneously at the same solution for explaining the origin of species. And 1 year later, in 1859, Darwin published his abstract of his theory on the origin of species. The 1858 Compromise gave equal credit to both Darwin and Wallace as the co-discoverers of the principle of evolution through natural selection. And it was common then to speak of the Darwin-Wallace theory. And that was fair. Darwin and Wallace had both arrived at the same idea, albeit through different pathways and on different timelines. They both deserved equal credit, even if it could be argued that Darwin should edge out Wallace by a nose. Why we don't call it the Wallace-Darwin theory. But gradually, the Darwin-Wallace theory became transformed into the Darwin theory, pushing Wallace to the background and elevating Darwin. And this is where Wallace became the moon, eclipsed by Darwin's sun. Was this fair? Well, historians of science have been debating for decades the reasons for this. One can make the argument, for example, that Darwin had thought of natural selection 20 years before Wallace did. It should be Darwin, therefore, who deserves the principal credit. Team Wallace, on the other hand, can argue that Darwin spent those 20 years dithering on barnacles and misguided theories about migration between islands. And when Wallace's letter arrived, Darwin was still dithering around. It was Wallace's evidence from his fieldwork that had made the pieces finally fall into place for Darwin. Arguably, all the pieces had already fallen into place for Wallace before they did for Darwin, so maybe it's Wallace that has the better claim to priority. Ultimately, this priority dispute comes down to hair-splitting, and at the very least, Wallace and Darwin deserve equal credit. Yet the question lingers, why was Wallace eclipsed? There are a number of claims out there for why. Some have claimed that Wallace was snubbed by the scientific elite of mid-century Britain. Darwin was a member in full standing in a club of gentlemen naturalists, and Wallace, in contrast, was a working-class upstart whose scientific accomplishments could never quite be taken seriously. Well, that seems shocking and unfair, if true. Class privilege was a real thing in 19th century England, but this can't really explain why Darwin eclipsed Wallace. Thomas Huxley, for example, was a prominent upstart himself, and class privilege didn't hinder him. Indeed, Huxley made a career out of going after the entrenched naturalist elites of church and academy. A related claim, a lurid claim frankly, is an accusation that Darwin actually plagiarized Wallace. The eclipse of Wallace was therefore a cover-up, engineered by Darwin and his prominent scientific friends. By this argument, Wallace had arrived at a complete theory of natural selection, which included the supporting evidence that Darwin lacked. Wallace's letters to Darwin supposedly tipped Wallace's hand, giving Darwin the missing pieces he needed to arrive at a complete theory himself. Again, it's an interesting claim, if a lurid one, but is it true? It's a case that turns on various gaps in the historical record, missing letters, disagreement over shipping schedules that carried the mail, those sorts of things. The evidence is contested, to say the least. And a cover-up is also jarringly out of character for both Darwin and Wallace. More likely, Wallace's eclipse was a consequence of Wallace's own modesty and generosity of spirit. Wallace opened up his correspondence with Darwin because Darwin was famous and Wallace admired him. Wallace had always deferred to Darwin as the greater naturalist, and to the end of his life, Wallace always maintained that his contribution paled compared to that of Darwin's. For all that, the fact is that Wallace and Darwin did have a falling out, an alienation of sorts, and surprisingly, the dispute was over cognition and mind. In that debate, Wallace came to advocate some rather, shall we say, outre thoughts about natural selection and human evolution, and that made Wallace an easy target of what we today would call cancel culture.